Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first of the Classics Colloquium series for the academic year of 2021 to 2022. And I will also note it is also Mexican Independence Day. Our guest this afternoon is Professor Alexander Jones. He is the Leon Levy Director and Professor of the History of the Exact Sciences in Antiquity at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University. He is also Professor of Mathematics in the Courant Institute, also at NYU. His research interests include mathematical and physical sciences and pseudosciences in antiquity, the Middle Ages, and early modern Europe. Some of his current work involves astronomy and astrology in the ancient Near East and the Greek world, the Antikythera mechanism, the scientific work of Ptolemy, the material culture of Greco-Roman science, and Greek mathematical sciences in general. And he also does things like papyrology, manuscript traditions, and textual criticism. A recent book or two, Mathematics, Metrology, and Model Contracts, a codex from late antique business education. There's one for our colleagues in the business college, co-edited with Roger Bagnall. And he's the author of Portable Cosmos, Revealing the Antikythera Mechanism, Scientific Wonder of the Ancient World. He also has worked on the commentaries of Pappus of Alexandria and an anonymous Byzantine astronomical handbook based on Islamic sources. He has numerous honors and awards, the Henry Allen Moe Prize in the Humanities by the American Philosophical Society. He's a member of the Académie Internationale d'Histoire des Sciences. He won the Francis Bacon Award from Caltech. He is a Guggenheim Fellow and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and won the University Medal for Arts and Sciences at the University of British Columbia. He is currently the principal investigator of an NEH-funded project, Shanati, reconstructing the daily ancient Babylonian chronology in synchronization with the proleptic Julian calendar. This is only a very small sample of our guest's tremendous work. So this afternoon, he is going to share with us on trying out the Babylonian numbers, transformations of Mesopotamian astral science in the Mediterranean world. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jones.
Thank you very much. I'll just go into my slideshow as quickly as possible and we can get going. Okay, so you now can see my PowerPoint and I'm about to start the slideshow. Good. All right, and let me just collapse.
And just let me add, if you can at all turn on your cameras, please do.
Well, yeah, at the moment, I don't think it counts for very much because I'll be showing pictures through this, but maybe a question period. It's nice to see people, but if you don't want to, that's fine too. I'm not pressuring anyone. Yeah, so let me just start with the geography of what I'm talking about today. I'm going to be talking about three initially distinct and more or less independent traditions of what I'm calling astral sciences. That's encompassing astronomy and practices and theories and beliefs that relate to astronomy, which includes astrology. And astrology is going to be a fairly big thing here. One of these traditions is the Greek one, another is the Egyptian one, and then the one that is going to be the transforming element as I get along with my talk is the Mesopotamian one, particularly Babylonian astronomy of the last several centuries BCE. So what I want to start off doing is just characterizing what were some of the main concerns of the Greek and Egyptian astral traditions before Hellenistic times. And then I'm going to skip forward to Roman times, skipping right over the Hellenistic period to give how the picture has changed. So starting with the Greeks, not the chronologically earlier one. Egyptian astronomy, as far as we can trace, is much older. But there are maybe more aspects of the Greek tradition worth bringing out here. So one of the things that earlier Greek astronomy is occupied with is the fairly straightforward task of designating constellations. Surprisingly few constellations actually show up in Greek sources before the later 5th century BCE, by the way. It's really just a handful that we have attested in texts, starting with, of course, the Homeric epics. And the landmark document, we don't have it in its original form, but we have the versification of it by Aratus, is Eudoxus's book that was a sort of verbal, prose, qualitative description of a system of about 48 constellations making up the sky visible in Mediterranean latitudes. Then there's a time element that's important, and it has really two branches to it. One is using basic observational astronomy to mark stages in the natural, what you could call the solar seasonal year, independent of calendar structures that use lunar months. So using solstices, which are in their earlier understanding, they're the rough dates when the sun rises at its furthest north or furthest south points on the horizon, equinoxes, which are the halfway dates between them, and the first and last appearances of stars and constellations, and correlating these with cycles of seasons, cycles of weather, and practices related to them like agriculture and sailing. So there's an older traditional element, not a specialized astronomy done by people we can really call astronomers. You find this in Hesiod's Works and Days. You find it in the Hippocratic writings. You find a bit of it in the peripatetic writings, Aristotle and Theophrastus talking about life cycles of plants and animals. But then as we get into the later 5th century onwards, you have people we really can speak of as astronomers. The earliest one of the earliest ones is Euctemon, an Athenian probably. Eudoxus is a very major figure, and then Callippus a little later on, who was a contemporary of Aristotle, who are making more complex systems of correlation that are using maybe 15 or 17 constellations, doing several different things over the course of the year as markers for weather cycles and seasonal cycles. Then calendars too that are using lunar months. There the problem is how do you control a lunar calendar so it stays in the long term in line with the seasons, so your festivals, for example, will be at the right seasons for whatever they're reflecting and celebrating. That's primarily becomes a matter of finding more and more precise cycles that will get almost a whole number of lunar months in a whole number of solar years, and preferably also a whole number of days, so that you can, in principle, assign to every single month in a cycle that might be 19 years long or 76 years long, or when you get to Hipparchus's version in the 2nd century BCE, nearly 3 centuries long, that every single month in every single year has a designated length, 29 days or 30. Every year has a designated number of lunar months, either 12 or 13. And so really you don't, once you have that, you don't need to do any real astronomy anymore. The astronomers, by finding these cycles, essentially put themselves out of work in that line. And you'll notice that some of these same names are coming up here, Eudoxus and Callippus. And the name that is most connected with this traditionally is Meton of Athens, for whom we have one particular date, 432 BCE, when he's supposed to have determined a date of summer solstice that was the starting date for a 19-year cycle. Then there's a more theoretical material, and part of this is going back to later pre-Socratics, people like Empedocles and then later, again, Eudoxus and Callippus get into this. This is mathematizing the idea of a geocentric cosmology. You have a spherical heavens that is spinning approximately once daily around a spherical Earth at the center. The Earth at the center is almost point-like in smallness compared to the celestial sphere. And then you start working from that to talking about more complex things that you can do with that. You explain the phases of the moon in terms of a spherical moon that is illuminated by the sun. Eclipses are explained by the lining up of the Earth, sun, and moon, and so forth. So That's more or less the main preoccupations of the earlier Greek astronomy before, let's say, around 300-ish BCE. In Egypt, it's a longer tradition, but for our purposes, it's a fairly simple matter of primarily concerned with stars rising and setting and crossing the meridian, and connecting these with dividing the night into 12 hours and connecting them with parts of the Egyptian calendar year, which is divided into typically into sets of 10 days that correspond to a system of 36 constellations called decans, which successively rise through the night, and the first 12 of them mark off 12 divisions of the night. So the coffin that I'm showing here is a kind of schematic. It's often sometimes called a star clock that says for each 10-day block in the calendar year, which are the 12 decans that mark the 12 hours of the night. There are some astronomical texts. They are not technical texts with sort of mathematical theory or anything like that. The most important of these, which we first find in a monumental context, in primarily funerary context in sort of later second millennium BCE Egypt, is the so-called Book of Nut. We actually now know its Egyptian title, which was translated as Fundamentals of the Courses of the Stars, which is mostly a kind of mythological astronomy. And it does involve the decans, brings in the sun and the moon and the planets. And much of it is about the path of the sun in its nighttime passage through the sky goddess Nut to be reborn in the morning. So it's very much a kind of religious-based approach to astronomy. Now, I want to draw attention to what's not in either of these traditions up to Hellenistic times. First of all, we don't find a practice of recording specific observations on specific dates, sort of establishing a kind of data bank for research, you might say. This is simply not happening. We do sometimes get reference to observations in sort of Greek texts, like Aristotle talking about seeing an occultation, but he doesn't say when he saw it. He just says he saw it, and that from that you can deduce that one heavenly body must be closer to the earth than another. And in Egypt, there's really nothing of the kind. Secondly, no interest in prediction of precise data, like forecasting eclipses with any precision, or saying where is a heavenly body like a planet going to be among the stars on a particular date. That's just not there. And thirdly, astrology in its most conventional sense, like personal astrology, taking a birth date and translating that into astronomical information that then is interpreted astrologically, that's just not there either. So these three things are not part of either the Egyptian or the earlier Greek tradition. So now I'm doing the fast forward to Roman times, or if you prefer, the CE centuries, or maybe just a little bit BCE, but not much. Here, I mean, we have a lot of sources, much more abundant than for the earlier traditions. Egypt is the most generous locale giving us materials, both on the Greek and the Egyptian side. I'm thinking here in terms of linguistic terms, things that are Greek language or Egyptian language, mostly in Demotic script. So we have texts. Most of these texts are in the usual writing media of Greco-Roman Egypt, papyri, ostraca. Ostraca more important for the Egyptian language materials, papyri more for the Greek, and then a few cases of wooden boards. And also we have some pictorial material, and this is particularly on the Egyptian side, like this coffin lid, which now is showing the sky goddess Nut with a zodiac around her. This is a coffin lid of someone who has a Greco-Roman name, not an Egyptian name. And in fact, we have a number of lids from this family, which are a mix of Egyptian and Greek and Latin names. So it's sort of multicultural, at least in the naming practices. So once we've come to this much later period, much of the older interest is still present, but we get an overwhelming preoccupation with new things. For one, we get a lot of predicted and calculated data, precise and numerical, much of it, not always. So here I'm showing on the left side a painted wooden board with a demotic planetary almanac that gives dates when each of the 5 planets that were known in antiquity, that's Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, were predicted to have passed from one sign of the zodiac to a neighboring sign of the zodiac. These are predictions about the past. The almanac was compiled after the dates it's referring to. And then on the other side of the slide, we have a fragment of a Greek table, which is computed dates when Mercury makes its disappearances as evening star. So these are dates in the Egyptian calendar, but written in the Greek language and Greek numerals. So that's one major new thing. Second major new thing is a huge amount of astrology is going on. And this is mostly nativity astrology, personal astrology, working from horoscopes, which are the configuration of heavenly bodies in the zodiac at the date and time of some individual's birth. And we have many. We have several hundred of these preserved in papyri. Papyri dominate for the Greek material, and in demotic ostraca, ranging from some that are from the second half of the 1st century BCE, right up to the very early 6th century CE, and then the archaeologically recovered materials are peters out. And we have the zodiac is of course present in that, and it becomes very present in visual culture as well. So you're seeing the zodiac as an astronomical concept for saying where positions of heavenly bodies are. In astrology for their astrological supposed functions and powers, and in visual culture we get images of the representing the 12 signs of the zodiac or the associated constellations. So on the left, this is the famous circular sky ceiling from Dendra, which is now on the Louvre, which is a mix of Egyptian, Greek, and some Babylonian constellation pictures. I'll come back to that Babylonian bit later on, of course. And on the right, we have an intaglio that is an individual's horoscope represented pictorially. So you have little busts for the 7 heavenly bodies, sun, moon, and 5 planets on the outer ring. And inside each sector is the picture for the sign of the zodiac in which the outer heavenly body is occupying at the date of somebody's birth. There are also numerals on this, but basically I'm showing this for the pictures. And we have lots and lots of Greco-Roman zodiac images, individual signs or the entire cycle. And not so many, but a lot of a significant number also of Egyptian ones from late Hellenistic and Roman times. So huge transformation has happened in both the Greek and the Egyptian traditions. To some extent, you see them come together. What's going on here? Well, I'm going to be telling not the whole story here. We don't know the whole story, for one thing, but also I'm going to focus on one element, which is the effect of contact in a very big way in Hellenistic times with Mesopotamian astronomy. Well, Mesopotamian astronomy itself is an old and very complex tradition. And like the other traditions, it had gone through a transformation period a bit earlier, around the middle of the 1st millennium BCE. We get 2 really good snapshots, if you can call it that, heavy documentation for Mesopotamian astral science that are not too far apart in time. One is about half a century in the Neo-Babylonian period, the very last gasp of the Babylonian Empire, the time of Kings Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal especially, when we have preserved an extensive correspondence between professional scholars whose duties involve omen watching and omen interpretation and the kings. It's all one way what we have. It's the letters and reports from the scholars to the kings. And we also have a lot of library-like reference material in the form of tablets that are compilations of omen text, which are sort of the raw material for this practice. This practice goes much farther back. We have tablets like the left tablet on the slide, going back to the old Babylonian period, earlier 2nd millennium, of astral omens like eclipses that are being treated as ominous and mostly dire, observable signs indicating the god's intentions to do nasty things to kings and kingdoms. So here's a typical report tablet from a scholar named Isar Shumu Eresh to King Esarhaddon, and it's a tablet that was sent after an eclipse of the moon happened. And the tablet mostly consists of citations of omen text, which are these if-then sentences. They're saying if an eclipse happens in the month such and such, then it means the death of the king of some district or country of the world will happen. And although there's no date explicitly in this tablet, the circumstantial combination of omen text allows us to reconstruct exactly which eclipse this is about. So this omen practice is huge. It's really what people doing astronomy are mostly preoccupied with in the period from, as far as we can tell, late Babylonian right up to the very end of the Assyrian period in the 7th century BCE. We do also have some stuff that's more like straight astronomy. Most importantly, this handbook, two very dense tablets of astronomical information, like lists of constellations in the order that they rise and set, information about the lengths of shadows of an upright stick through the stages of the day and through the stages of the year and so forth. Again, there's a certain amount of numerical material in here, but it's not a highly predictive kind of astronomy. But then things start changing, and the process of change happens about contemporary with these late Assyrian texts, but where we see it is in Babylon and in Babylonian. Records of observations tied to dates start being kept, and the earliest ones that we know of are eclipse records that start around the middle of the 8th century BCE, apparently, and are kept in a very systematic way. We don't have tablets that date from that early, but we have tablets that are compiling information according to structures and cycles and so on mostly from the second half of the first millennium BCE. And a little bit later than that, the famous series of so-called Babylonian Astronomical Diaries starts up around the 7th or 6th century BCE, where you have tablets typically recording half a year, large tablets that go night by night through the 6 or 7 months of a half year, recording things like the moon passing by, stars, eclipses, planets making appearances and disappearances, and other things like weather, prices of commodities, river level, reports of local and news coming from sometimes fairly large distances. The diary fragment I'm showing you is a particularly famous one that records the Battle of Gaugamela almost immediately after it actually happened, as well as the eclipse of the moon that happened shortly before the battle. Right around the middle of the millennium, we start getting what we call, I put in inverted commas in this slide, but from now on, I'm just going to call them Babylonian horoscopes. These are tablets that are connected with the birth date of some individual, not a king, but some, I hesitate to say ordinary people. They're probably elite, but we don't know a lot about them. Many of them are not named. But they will typically give a birth date and then a list of astronomical positions and phenomena that pertain either to that date or to dates within a range of a month or maybe several months in some cases of that birth date. And occasionally they also include statements like he will have children and so on, but most of them do not give forecasts for the individual as written things in the tablet. These start being produced in the late 5th century BCE and continue up to, I think the latest ones are actually as late as the 1st century BCE, at earliest the 2nd. And the Zodiac comes into being as a concept. In earlier Mesopotamian astronomy, there was definitely an idea that there is a pathway through the field of stars and constellations where the moon is seen to travel night by night, and also where the planets are seen to travel. And it can be inferred that the sun also travels, though we never see the sun with those stars. This is in Mulapin, that handbook of astronomical data from around 1000 BCE. But this path of the moon gets settled down into 12 standard constellations around the 5th century. And then it gets severed from the actual stars of the constellations, so the names and the pictures keep being associated with them, and becomes 12 equal slices of that belt, which then can be divided into 30 degrees each. So it becomes a kind of a ruler along which the heavenly bodies move. This is a really important innovation because it gives a kind of framework for positions that is precise and allows you to start getting mathematical. About the same time the zodiac comes in, you have this the huge development of a very mathematical predictive astronomy, which is like spreadsheets. It's like very much like Excel spreadsheets in which you calculate past or future dates of some phenomenon happening over and over again. It might be new moon crescents, or it might be Venus making an appearance as morning star, something like that. And this is all using arithmetic, using base 60 numbers, so-called sexagesimal arithmetic. And the rules of calculation are using basic arithmetic operations like addition and subtraction, occasionally proportions like using multiplication and division. But it's fundamentally just arithmetic operating on numbers that are sometimes very messy looking, and they're in this base 60. So you have typically a sort of something like a whole number of degrees followed by 60ths, 3600ths, and so on, what we would call degrees, minutes, seconds. So the tablet I'm showing you on this slide is a particularly complex type, which is about new moon visibility calculations, going row by row is month by month, column by column are all the elements of the calculation. My slides have frozen. I'm going to have to do something. I apologize for my computer. So yes, so this is very, very complex mathematical stuff. We all using base 60 arithmetic, and I'm just going to move on from that. So this is just an example of a horoscope, Babylonian horoscope, where you can see all these things coming together in the document. You have, first of all, the horoscopic astrology is happening here. You're seeing positions are given in signs of the zodiac, and some of the positions are numerical, like the sun and the moon are given degrees or degrees and minutes. These have to have been computed. They were not observed. The positions of Mercury and Saturn in particular show this because they would not have been visible at the date of this person's birth. So, so we can see, these things that are coming into the later Babylonian astronomy correspond to a large part of the things that show up in Roman period, Greek, and Egyptian astrosciences. So obviously there's a connection here. And this connection is something that mostly we've learned about since cuneiform began being read again in the mid to late 19th century. But one element of it, in a sense, we've always known, which is that the Babylonians had a reputation as being great recorders of astronomical observations. A lot of the reports we get in classical texts about this are highly exaggerated. They'll talk about the Babylonians observing maybe for hundreds of thousands of years in the past. But there's something obviously much more solid that you find in Ptolemy's great 2nd century CE treatise on astronomy, which we call the Almagest, which is actual reports with dates on them of eclipses of the moon and later on some planetary observations, which evidently had been translated out of Babylonian sources into Greek with some other transformations that we can now recognize. But these were familiar even centuries ago. For example, when Kepler published his great set of astronomical tables in the 1620s, he gave this very elaborate frontispiece that's a kind of encapsulated history of the landmarks in developing planetary theory leading up to well, Kepler is modest and doesn't put himself on the pedestal, but down below, but it is leading up to Kepler's own versions of the theories. And he represents these figuratively through the great astronomers of the past who are standing by columns which get more and more elaborate as you go from the back to the front, as you go from the distant past to the near present, with Copernicus and Tycho Brahe with their nice classical columns made of smooth stone. Further back, the columns are clearly of brick. And the furthest back one, the fellow with the funny hat, is a Babylonian astronomer, or at least he's supposed to be one, whose column is just a log of wood with even the remnants of the boughs of the tree still present, because Kepler sees this as the beginning of it all. But then with reading cuneiform tablets, a lot more started showing up that we could not have got out of Greco-Roman evidence. In particular, we find that the Babylonians had the Zodiac much earlier than you find it attested anywhere else. You get the idea of measurement of a cycle or a circle into 360 degrees. The base 60 notation, which was already familiar from writers like Ptolemy because it's their toolbox for doing astronomical arithmetic. The earlier horoscopes, and a handful of things like figures for the mean speed of the moon in degrees and minutes traveling through the zodiac per day, which turned out to be present in the Babylonian astronomy. And we were before that familiar with them from certain Greek sources from Hellenistic times. Now, one figure who really has a lot of connections with specific paths in this material that was coming to be known from, let's say, the 1880s up to the 1950s is Hipparchus, one of the big names in Greek astronomy. Eudoxus, Hipparchus, Ptolemy, these are the three big names. Hipparchus is the one, maybe the one that is most enigmatic because we've lost all but one of his writings. The one we have is the critical commentary on Aratus, but all the stuff on theoretical astronomy is only known through reports, mostly Ptolemy. Well, in the late 1980s, Gerald Toomer put together all the testimonia we have connecting Hipparchus with things that we now know are Babylonian. And he suggested that maybe Hipparchus keeps showing up because he was the principal channel for transmission of Babylonian astronomical theories, data, concepts into the Greek world. This was in a short article he wrote in 1988, and it didn't win very wide acceptance. So I think so far as the astronomical observation records go, it's actually quite plausible. But meanwhile, and this is really since about 1950, and some of it ongoing now, we have made significant text corpora that are coming under study, which are bringing us a big step further in understanding what this relationship is between Babylonian astral science and the Greco-Egyptian stuff. First of all, we have study of what I would specifically call astronomical papyri and other archaeologically recovered documents. They may be astrological in purpose, but they primarily contain or exclusively contain astronomical data like computed dates and positions of planetary phenomena. Oxyrhynchus is the biggest source for these, mostly the Grenfell and Hunt excavations, but also other papyri from Oxyrhynchus that are now in Florence and other collections. Secondly, people are starting to study the Babylonian Astrological Tablets. These have really been set aside in favor of studying the more astronomical material, the observation texts of the mathematical astronomy. And there aren't so many of them, of the astrological ones, and they're quite difficult to understand. But now they're really starting to get more intense attention, and they're yielding a lot of quite striking parallels and precedents for the Greco-Egyptian stuff. And lastly, and this is one of the, to me, one of the really exciting developments, is that there are very large numbers of papyri and ostraca in Demotic from Egypt, particularly coming from Roman period Egyptian temple sites that are astrological treatises, astrological texts, horoscopes. Very little of this has yet been read, very little is edited, but it is now starting to get the more intense attention from the handful of dematists in the world. And it's clear that we're, even in just a few years, we will know a lot more from that source than we know now. So starting with the Greek astronomical papyri, same year, and in fact the same collected paper volume that Gerald Toomer's paper on Hipparchus and Babylonian astronomy appeared in. One of Otto Neugebauer's very last articles was one in which he published a description and transcription of a little scrap of papyrus in a private collection that he had been sent a photo of, which he realized almost immediately was in Greek numerals and notations the equivalent of a Babylonian spreadsheet tablet like this one. Calculations of lunar full moons or new moons. And although only 2 columns are partly preserved, he could identify them as corresponding to columns in these Babylonian tablets that have to do with calculating the date and time of when the sun and the moon are lined up. So this was really quite exciting for him, and it really has began a process of realizing that there's a lot of this kind of material out there. You know, I would have the privilege of working through everything that we could track down in the Oxyrhynchus papyri in Oxford that were astronomical tables and texts. And a lot more of this kind of thing, particularly planetary predictions using mathematics, started showing up. And they are just done using the same rules of calculation that the Babylonian tablets used several centuries earlier. And you know, they're mostly from Oxyrhynchus are the examples that we have. I've shown you one example we have that has a known provenance at one of these Fayum Egyptian temple sites, though it is in Greek. Now, the astrological tablets from Babylon and Uruk in Babylonia are showing us more and more concepts that we're familiar with from Greek astrology. And the tablets, of course, again, are significantly earlier and clearly are the antecedents of the Greek uses of these things. I'm not going to run through all these. I'm just showing you there's a list of about 6 technicalities about working with positions of heavenly bodies in the zodiac for horoscopes or other prognostications that now we know are in tablets, and probably more will show up. So how did it happen? Well, Hipparchus is not going to do for this kind of stuff. It's clearly a large-scale transmission of a lot of stuff that is both astronomical and astrological. I think what we're dealing with is a diaspora of scholars trained in these Babylonian traditions. These are the people who start showing up in Greco-Roman context being called Chaldaioi, or Chaldeans. Later on, Chaldean comes just to mean an astrologer. But I think when you go back to uses as early as about the 2nd century BCE, these mean people who are in some sense either actual Babylonians or people who have a very close relationship with Babylonian scholarship. And it always means Babylonian scholars connected with astral science. Now, there's a very interesting, very nice inscription that was found a couple of decades ago in central Greece, in Larissa, which is honoring somebody with the Greek name Antipatros, son of Antipatros, who comes from Syria. And he is a citizen of Homolion, but he is a Chaldaios astronomos, a Chaldean astral specialist. And unfortunately, the inscription breaks off before we get any more detail about it. But I think what we're dealing with here is somebody who is probably practicing some form of astral divination in Greece in the 2nd century BCE. We get, I mean, Cato the Elder in Italy is warning the farm overseer not to consult Chaldeans, which only makes sense if there were some available to consult. So I think we're seeing signs of the spread of specialists quite wide in the Mediterranean world. Egypt, of course, is the really important place for this kind of thing. Here's a 1st century CE, 2nd century CE papyrus horoscope, unfortunately just a fragment from near the beginning, naming the person, giving the birth date, and giving the position of the sun in the zodiac, and then we have almost nothing else. But even this is interesting for the introductory part, because the astrologer who's writing this text is referring to the sages of old, out of whom the tradition of his astrology is coming. And the very first he names are Chaldeans. And then he moves into people who are Egyptian sages of old, Petosiris, King Necheus, who's usually called Nekepsos or Nekepso in Greek texts. These are these were supposed to be the two founders of the Egyptian horoscopic tradition. Hermes, well, that really means Thoth, and Imuthis, this is Imhotep. So we're connecting with Egyptian ideas of origins of wisdom, but connected with Chaldeans as the very first named. So at the moment, we have 3 temple sites, which are basically Egyptian-speaking or bilingual Egyptian Greek-speaking communities in a hieratic context, who are practicing astrology and leaving some kind of a written paper trail, you could call it, papyrus or ostraca trail, for this activity. Teptunis, which has yielded a lot of demotic and Greek papyri of astronomical and astrological texts. Narmuthis, where we have a cache of ostraca, especially in a weird mix of demotic and Greek, which are connected with many of which are connected with horoscopic practice. And most recently recognized Athribis in Upper Egypt. The other 2 are in the Fayum, where also there are a lot of astronomical documents that are just beginning to be explored. But I'm also showing you Petrie's drawing of a tomb ceiling decoration from Athribis, which is showing pictorially an aspect of the same practice. This is actually a horoscope represented pictorially, with the figures of the zodiac and then other figures, generally little figures of birds representing where the sun, moon, and planets were at the date of somebody's birth, and this is 2nd century CE. The iconography in these Egyptian zodiacs has some very, very strongly Babylonian elements that you don't find in Greek zodiacs or Roman zodiacs. In particular, two of the sign pictures. The one for Sagittarius. In the Babylonian zodiac, Sagittarius is Pabilsag, which is this mixed figure, sort of winged horse figure, but it has 2 heads, a human head facing forward and a lion's head facing backward, and 2 tails, a horse's tail and a scorpion's tail. In the Egyptian zodiacs, you find with a touch of Egyptianizing to it, but it is precisely this strange mixed figure where Greek Sagittarii are really just a kind of centaur with a bow and arrow, but none of this extra stuff. And Leo, it's not so much the figure of the lion itself, but the combination it comes with. We have this Babylonian astrological tablet where there's a picture of the lion striding on the sort of dragon figure with a very serpent-like body and a bird pecking at its tail. And these are the constellations: Leo, of course, Hydra, and Corvus in the Greco-Roman system. And we find in the Egyptian zodiac pictures this same combination again. Whereas a Greek or Roman zodiac image would just show the lion. And some of the most exciting stuff is very recent, is finding that in these Egyptian temples, there's a very high level of knowledge at the theoretical end of the mathematical astronomy from Babylonia. More than we find in the Greek papyri that represent this sort of astronomy. They are doing calculations with Babylonian methods, but in a way that's expressed in these ostraca in a way that shows that they had an understanding of sort of deep level mathematics of it, which we don't even find in cuneiform texts. This is stuff that was worked out by modern scholars in the last half century or so by inference from the structures of the Babylonian systems. And we find that Egyptian temple people, priests you can call them loosely, know this stuff, which suggests that there's some very close connection between the Babylonians and the Egyptians. Temple-based group to temple-based group, which maybe suggests that the channel runs through Egypt to the Mediterranean world as much as directly to Greek-speaking people. But I just want to close now with the 2 major legacies of this remarkable fusion of 3 traditions that I think we can date without being too precise to Hellenistic times. One of them is the style of astrology, which became hugely popular in the broader Roman world and spreads not literally everywhere else, but to many other parts of the Euro-Afro-Asiatic landmass, to India, into the Islamic world, to Western Europe in the later Middle Ages, Essentially, modern astrology is the descendant of Greco-Roman astrology, and it's really a Greco-Egyptian tradition, which has this major Babylonian infusion, but has been transformed to become much more complex and much more time sensitive, so that you're really paying attention to the instant of someone's birth and not just to the date. So that's one very long-lasting outcome of this. Another is Ptolemy's astronomy and the style of astronomy it represents, which is combining the Greek geometrical conception of heavenly motions as made out of circular motions, very philosophically appealing to people coming out of the Platonic Aristotelian tradition, with the Babylonian numerical toolbox. But now, because we're talking about circles, we're not going to be calculating phenomena just using addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, but we're going to start using basically early trigonometric functions that are representing circular motions seen from some vantage point like the Earth. And this is essentially the story of a whole line of astronomy running from people like Hipparchus and Ptolemy in Antiquity, but especially Ptolemy, through, again, India, through Islam, through Western Europe, right up to the European scientific revolution. And Kepler takes his starting point from as much from Ptolemy as from Copernicus. And it's not a static tradition, but the jump from what Greek astronomy was, say, in 300 BCE to what it is for Ptolemy around, say, 150, sorry, BCE to around 150 CE with Ptolemy is a really radical change. And then the next more than 1,000 years, nothing that radical happens to it, which is where I'm going to stop. And I hope I haven't run too much over time despite the hiatus. So I'll stop the share. How are we doing? Oh, not too bad.
That's fine. Thank you so much. Applause. We have plenty of time for questions.
Great. How are questions going to come in the chat, or?
Well, we can do both chat and people can ask on their camera. Let's see, where was it? Jonathan Reeder, are there any connections between astronomical features of the Epic of Gilgamesh and Greek literature or astral sciences?
If there are, it's really distant, I think. I'm not aware of anything that one could call substantial that really connects with that tradition.
Okay. Rachel Rucker, when you say that the Babylonians understood the theory behind these astrological records, what does that mean exactly?
It's a very loaded word, of course. The thing about what we have in cuneiform tablets, and I should emphasize, we have a huge amount of material, particularly the late Babylonian stuff from around the middle of the first millennium to, it even runs into CE. The latest astronomical tablets are from around the 70s CE. But we're talking about thousands of fragments of tablets, and they do not do theory. They do recording observations, they do spreadsheet calculations, they do what we call procedure texts, which are the instructions for doing those calculations. There's a certain amount of more like prose texts that are describing information. But when you have a mathematical method of calculating something that's of any complexity, and take those lunar spreadsheets with 20 and some columns of data, all of different meaning they're building up to calculating, is the new moon crescent visible on this night or will be the next night? Obviously there is some kind of an underlying understanding going into that. It doesn't mean that there is something like what someone like Ptolemy would say is astronomical understanding, which means really having a belief founded in the empirical evidence and some first principles about what is a planet doing geometrically up in a three-dimensional cosmology. That's probably not part of what feeds into this. But there is a kind of analysis of a complicated phenomenon that involves a number of different factors, like how far north or south is the moon of the ecliptic circle, how fast is the moon moving per day around the date of a new moon, things like that, all of which have to be separated out. They have different periodicities, and then they're being combined through all these rules to get a result. And that's not just straight basic empiricism at all. This involves a pretty sophisticated analysis. We don't know the story of that analysis because there's nothing like a historical narrative in our text to tell us how did the Babylonians develop these things. We get the abundant material after it's come into being.
Dan asks the question, Dr. Jones, excellent presentation. Your background is wonderful in combining mathematics and classics. I'm wondering if you can talk about how you carved out your specific area of expertise in academia and any advice for burgeoning scholars.
Well, it wasn't really according to a plan so much as just finding a soft spot, I would say. But when I was in school, I mostly did math and computer science. And university, I went abruptly into classics, and then around the end of my undergraduate days, I started finding that there was actually all this scientific material. We're talking about Greek and Latin scientific material, which most classicists don't really pay much attention to. And then I found Neugebauer's classic lecture book, The Exact Sciences and Antiquity. I mean, you'll notice my sort of job title actually has the title of that book built into it. That wasn't my doing, but it was that book that connected me with the idea that there's all this material of a very documentary nature. I mean, as soon as you start getting into this, you're no longer dependent overwhelmingly on a medieval manuscript tradition. Well, that is an important part of our evidence, but you also all this archaeologically recovered stuff, and it's cross-cultural. And I found this just fascinating. So I've really stuck with that as sort of the core of what I care about since then.
Dr. Story, is there time for me to slide in for a quick question?
Sure.
So Dr. Jones, I'm really curious, particularly at the end of your presentation, you spend some time talking about the kind of burgeoning category of the Chaldean in the Greco-Roman imagination, which, as someone working deeply in Aramaic, I know mostly from, say, biblical Aramaic sources like the Book of Daniel, being spoken of in parallel with dream interpretation. And I'm wondering if any of the material you're looking at in the astrological and astronomical intersects that category at all, or if we're seeing different terminology being built around and trying to describe two different phenomena that come to the same word.
You know, I don't know from Greco-Roman material. Offhand, I can't remember any particular connection with that kind of divination for Chaldeans. That may just be my ignorance. I mean, there are a lot of references, there are a lot of uses of this word Chaldeos, or the Latin counterpart of it, scattered through ancient literature, but it's, and I've mostly been focusing on what can we find from particularly from sources that are either the earliest or they're reflecting the earliest periods where the intense contact seems to be happening. Because that's the period in which I think it's most likely that these really are bringing us to something like actual Babylonian scholars. But they are very much connected with astrology and astronomy. And that, you know, I can't read. I don't know the Aramaic and biblical. I mean, I'm sort of vaguely aware from Bible references to Chaldeans, but it doesn't seem to be really that much of an overlap. I think scholarship is very common there, but the way the scholarship is being used is different.
Thank you.
Can I go back to the question about, you know, the underlying stuff that's going on? I don't know a lot about ancient science, but one of my favorite examples is the Maya Stela 1 at the site of Kobah, where the inscription gives a long count date that just goes to so many periods. And it's the equivalent of 10 to 1 10 times 2.6, 24 digits number of days into the future. And I was wondering your comment about, you know, the Babylonian mathematics. Is there any possibility of figuring out how they figured out these kinds of things without being in the room and hearing their discussions. I always wonder what this scribe was saying to his colleagues about, I'm just going to put this date way in the future and, just almost just for fun.
Yeah, so some parts of the puzzle I think are easier for us to make plausible guesses about, at least, and this kind of long-term stuff is an example where I think we can do it and probably be more or less right, because there what we're dealing with is periodicities. The harder part is the short-term behavior of heavenly bodies, like Mars doing it sort of 3 steps forward, 2 steps back through the zodiac with the retrograde motion and so on, how the Babylonians get whatever level of detail about predicting that is less accessible to us. But how they would get something like a long-term cycle that may be several centuries long, we have a pretty good idea of that, partly because there are little hints in the text and partly because there's just a plausible way to do it, which is to take short cycles that are within the span, within less than a century, where you have observational records and you can just look for repetitions of something happening close to the same date in the same part of the zodiac, but not exactly. So you might get something like maybe, the crudest level, Jupiter, goes through the zodiac once about every 12 years. And in those 12 years, it's going to do 11 cycles of catching up with, or having the sun catch up with it. And so it goes through a cycle of visibility to invisibility 11 times in 12 years. Now that's pretty crude. It's not, you can't use that to make long-term forecasts. But then you go up to something like 71 years and you find that there's a better one. And maybe its error is in the opposite direction and a bit smaller. And so what you can do is figure out how you can combine so many 12 years with so many 71 years to get something that will more or less cancel out the errors. And you don't need to have observation records that run for 400 some years to do that. You just outcome some number like 427 years, and you plug that into the mathematical structures for predicting the short-term behavior, and it's going to stay in line with Jupiter in the long term very well. In the short term, there are going to be quite significant errors. So this is a way of thinking that we're pretty sure the Babylonians are doing. Actually, when we get onto the Greek side, although there's not so much evidence for it, but there's a stream of Greek mathematical astronomy that's interested in making projections tens of thousands of years into the past. And again, this is wildly out of range of any observational foundation that they have. And there were tables for calculating planetary positions that were used by astrologers for their own time, but they had this name in Greek, the Ionioi Canones, the Eon tables. And it seems that these were tables where the sort of zero date was something like 37,500 years before some observation Hipparchus made. And so this huge span of years is sort of built into the tables. It's completely useless for practical purposes, but it's making some kind of a statement about the claim that we actually have, we who are making this astronomy have control of astronomical precision over that span of time. It's in fact quite fictitious, but it's there.
I have one more question. if someone else have a question, the Ptolemaic system, of course, is geocentric.
Yes.
Are the Babylonians geocentric, or are they different?
Probably they're Babylonia-centric. We have no basis, even when you're getting into the period from which we get all this mathematical stuff in the later astrology. This is Hellenistic Babylonian. There's contacts with Greeks in Babylon and in Uruk, the two centers where this stuff is being done. But there's little, there's really almost no trace of anything in these cuneiform tablets doing astronomy and astrology reflecting possible contacts with Greek traditions in that direction. Anything like a spherical Earth, for example, just not built into what they do. In a sense, what they do doesn't need to have any assumption about the shape of the Earth or the shape of the heavens. It's all about sort of directions you're looking, and the horizon is important and the meridian is important, but there's no celestial sphere built conceptually into what they do. It's remarkable that so much can be transferred from that kind of a conception of what astronomy is about and what the world is like into this highly geometrical, geocentric framework that the Greeks had. And a lot can be transferred, but it gets transformed in the process. So Greek astrological sort of theory is built on the geocentric cosmology and a sort of vaguely Aristotelian outside influences inside cosmology, which I think Babylonian would find totally incomprehensible.
Interesting. Any other questions? Well, with that, we will thank our guest very sincerely for a fascinating program. And just let me mention that we have 2 more colloquia scheduled. On October 20th, Professor Melissa Muller will talk about Sappho. And then on November 16th, Professor Beth Severy-Hoven will talk about Petronius. And so we'll see you all hopefully there. And thank you, Professor Jones, for starting us off in such an interesting fashion this year.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I hope the hiatus in the middle wasn't too destructive of the talk.
Not at all. Not at all.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. And so goodbye, everyone.